I would like to talk a little bit about what happens when we start reading Shakespeare a different way, which means using the resources of computing to exhaustively churn through Shakespeare's text and to look for features that you or I never would have thought to count. So let's begin with the printed book, which is the vehicle that gave us Shakespeare. Had Shakespeare been born 80, 90 years before he was, we probably wouldn't be talking about him because the printed book would not have been the transformative media technology that it was and available to him to share his words. The book, like this one, is something that is designed for a human being. Those of us with stereo vision and can lean over, we can lean over a book like this. And at the Folger, we're learning, actually, that people, in addition to reading books, leave their DNA in the books. And so we're probably the first research library to start systematically sampling the DNA that is left in our collection. Because a book is the perfect device for capturing genetic material. It's closed, it's put on a cool shelf, and it's not disturbed. But I'm not here to talk about that project today. Project Dust Bunny, as it's called. This is what happens in our Renaissance reading room. About 800 readers a year come to the Folger to work with the largest Shakespeare collection in the world and one of the largest collections of early English print and manuscript. The collection covers all of Europe from roughly 1470 to 1730. And you can see our readers doing what readers do, which is poring over books. Sometimes they're using their laptops. It has become multimedia in our reading room. But in the end, it involves paying attention to a text. I wanted to show you this picture from an early modern book. This is Agostino Romelli's book on machines, and this is what's known as a book wheel. For the great scholars of the Renaissance, if you were going to collate or look at multiple editions of a text and try to compare the sources, as we associate with biblical criticism, you might need a machine like this. And so here's our dutiful scholar sitting. He can turn that wheel and probably look at his Latin text and his Greek text and his Hebrew text. That is the laboratory for an early modern reader. This is the bomb at Bletchley Park. This is a different kind of contraption. But I wanted to start with this image because one of the things that the Bletchley scientists did, and Alan Turing, the father of modern computer science, was working and guiding this project, was to understand how to take a potentially inexhaustible resource, which is computation, and to churn through possibilities when it comes to text. It was a large-scale text analysis project. The kind of work that I do is different, but it is part of that genealogy. What I do is I take the fully digitally searchable texts of Shakespeare's plays, and I ask a computer to go through all of those plays and count certain features. And what I get as a result is a chart that has the names of plays or of characters and speakers on one side, and then the percentage of features that were counted in that particular sample on the other side. This is a completely alienating way of looking at a wonderful play. And so what I want to offer you today is a meditation on why this might be interesting to those of us who love to read Shakespeare the old-fashioned way, which is at the speed at which we can hear it or see it on the page. To illustrate this, I'll talk about three words: if, and, or but. These are words that I hope you'll be able to remember, and I'll give you an example of how to think about Shakespeare using if, and, or but. So I take my laptop, which is in my bag over there, and I say, I would like you to go through 38 Shakespeare plays. They've been fully digitized from the Folger Shakespeare editions, And now I want you to count every occurrence of the words if, and, or but. The machine does that, and then it highlights where it's found these words. I strip out the names of characters. I strip out the stage directions that tell us exit pursued by a bear, enter with flourish. Those things aren't spoken on stage, so we're just interested in the spoken words of a play. And when we count all of those things in 38 plays, we can then array them in something that you could call an if, and, or but space. This is if, and, or but space. It has 3 dimensions, and I'm showing you a cube only so that you can start to imagine what a caricature of the richness of a play looks like when we've reduced each of those plays only to the number of times these 3 features occur. So in this 3-dimensional space, if you have more but, you're further out here. If you have more if, you're further over here. And if you have more and, you're higher up. Once you array the plays in a 3-dimensional space like this, the properties of this space are well understood, and you can start asking questions about how things cluster together and the distances between the items. So I'll just put 3 labels on these dots. Remember, each of these dots represents a Shakespeare play, and its position corresponds to how much of these 3 words it has. Twelfth Night and the Two Gentlemen of Verona are down around here, and then up at the top is Henry V. So the first question I ought to ask is that an accident? Is that just something that happened? Well, I have the advantage of 400 years of scholarship on Shakespeare's plays, in addition to the designations that were created by Shakespeare's 2 friends, Heming and Condell, who created the first folio, and they actually divided the plays up into 3 groups. They said there are 3 kinds of plays: comedies, histories, and tragedies. And then in the 19th century, a Victorian critic named Edward Dowden said, well, there's one more kind of play. It's called a late play, and they're different. And most of us agree that they are different. So I've pulled those out as well. So up here we have a key. If you're a red circle, you're a comedy. If you're a green plus sign, you're a history. If you're a blue triangle, you're a late play. And if you're an orange X, you are a tragedy. Now, I don't expect you to memorize this diagram, and I don't expect you to believe the conclusions I'm about to make, except for me to say that when I study the groupings of these items, I find that at least statistically, some of these items, the red circles, tend to cluster in a certain part of this space. And they are opposed to another cluster of items, these green squares, which are at a different corner of this space. There is a way to measure whether or not that difference in location is happening by chance. And the answer is no, it is not. It's highly unlikely that Shakespeare's comic plays are pushed to one part of this space and his history plays are pushed to another. That seems to be happening in some more deliberate way. And so I'll show you a couple of pictures here. This is looking head-on at the plays. From left to right is if. If you have a lot of if, you're further over on the right here. And from bottom to top is and. And keeping track of these 2 items, the comedies and the histories, you'll notice that if you drew a diagonal line here, you'd find more histories having a lot of and lacking if. They tend to go up and to the left. Conversely, if you're a comedy, you tend to have more if and less and. Now, there's some outliers here, and they're very interesting, but statistically this holds. Second look at this space. Now we've got and again on the y-axis, and here now we have but. If you have more but, you tend to be a comedy while having less and. This is important because the comparisons we're making assume that having something can also imply not having something else. And the pattern that we're looking at, which turns out to be one of the ways we can recognize the difference between a Shakespearean comedy and a Shakespearean history, is a pattern of having certain kinds of words and not having certain kinds of other words. In this case, I'm now going to put some bubbles around the items, just trying to give you another look at this space to see that the red items are moving roughly down and to the right, and the green up and to the left. Okay, here's the statistical description of what's going on. Without knowing anything about what anyone ever said about these plays, just counting those three features, it seems unlikely to be chance that any play having more and will have less of the other two features, which is if or but. And it turns out that they also happen to be history plays, which means that the statistical pattern overlays nicely with something that we human beings notice as a feature of a plot, a story of dynastic progression, of battles, of succession. Conversely, plays that have a lot of if and but tend to lack the other feature, and they tend to be what's known as comedies. What happens when a Shakespeare critic says comedy? Well, there's a human definition of this word, which is it's a play that ends in a marriage. That's the Renaissance definition of a comedy. It's a play that requires a sustained misunderstanding. So I probably have two people who are talking to each other and not quite understanding each other, but they never manage to sort it out until they get to Act 5. It's a plot that requires sustained dialogue that never lands upon the truth. Finally, I could give you examples. I could say, a comedy is As You Like It, Twelfth Night, or other examples. But what's happened as a result of this experiment is that I've now added another description, a parallel description. You could also say that a comedy is a play that favors if and but at the expense of and. And that's not something we would have ever thought to look for. Now think about where these plays were performed. When you're performing with a limited number of actors, let's say you have 12 actors or less, you're in a small theater lit by candlelight, or it's a daytime performance. You have no soundtrack, you have no flashbacks. You're going to have to do certain things with your language. And that's the constraint I want to get to now. You remember that history plays are stories of dynasties, of armies, and in the beginning of Henry V, the prologue comes out and says, you just have to imagine the vasty fields of France, because I can't get an army onto the stage. What happens when you can't get an army onto the stage? You have to report what happened off stage. And the use of and in these history plays is, I believe, a direct result of the fact that whenever something happens off stage, somebody has to show up and say, and then this happened, and then the Duke of Alençon did this, and then France did that, and that, and that. If you want to tell a story about armies and dynasties, you will have to report what happened. And if you're going to recite all of that, you will need the word and. Now the comedies. Instead of trying to bring crowds of armies on stage, I want to focus on two people. The comic pair, the pair that's going to go on and get married. If you're telling a story about frustrated courtship, you are staging a drama of conditions. I'm going to explain what I mean by that. It can sometimes mean reticence or confusion. So if you said you loved me, I would agree, but you didn't. The dialogue in comedy is often about testing hypotheses. It's about trying to establish the facts. And it's also about conflict. It's two people, two lovers negotiating over what they meant when they said this or that. And if you want to do that, you will have to use words like if or but. And I'll just show you an example of the comic pattern. This is the recognition scene from As You Like It, and Rosalind says, "To you I give myself, for I am yours." And to Orlando, "To you I give myself, for I am yours." And here's the series of ifs. Duke Sr., "If there be truth in sight, you are my daughter. If there be truth in sight, you are my Rosalind. If sight and shape be true, why then my love at you." In creating the confusion and sorting it out, you've got to use these words. We would never think to count them. And once you start to go back into the plays and take a look at them and look at these words in context, this is Sebastian, who's trying to figure out what's happening in Illyria. He says, For though my soul disputes well with my senses that this may be some error, but no madness, yet doth this accident and flood of fortune so far exceed all instance, all discourse, that I am ready to distrust my eyes and wrangle with my reason that persuades me to any other trust but that I am mad. And further down here, the ifs. This is what happens in slow motion when someone has incomplete information and is trying to put it together. You can think of it as a dancer who wants to do certain things with his or her upper body, but in order to get those things done, their feet have to be in a certain place. Our language works in the same way. You and I notice what happens from the waist up. Maybe the title of this speech could be Shakespeare from the Waist Down. But other things have to happen below. Similarly, this is Henry V describing the victory at Agincourt. I'm not going to bring the army on stage, but let me tell you what happened. O lusty earls, Grand Pré and Roussy, Fauconbridge and Foix, Beaumont and Marle, Vendôme and Lestrade, and. If you're a play and you deal with reported action, you're going to need and. And if you remember some of those diagrams, there were actually comedies that strayed up into that history territory. The play that looks most like a history that's a comedy is A Midsummer Night's Dream. Well, why is that? Because half the action in A Midsummer Night's Dream is performed by fairies, and therefore could never be acted on stage. So it has to be reported. And when Shakespeare built A Midsummer Night's Dream, he did it in the same way he did as the history plays before them. He said, I'll use a reporter to describe all of that, and I'll use the magic of narrative to paint that picture. I'll use a lot of and. It's a bit like looking at a constellation. We see certain elements. We may imagine the fuller picture, but there are stars in that constellation that we've never seen. And it's the resources of computation that can draw our attention to those and also draw our attention to the kind of craft that a great playwright brings to the problem of telling a certain kind of story. It's a little bit like the problem of figuring out whether a horse lifts all four hoofs when it's running. A photographer named Muybridge actually created a system of triggering cameras one after another very quickly. This was at Stanford in the 1870s, and he proved that all four hoofs come off the ground. Well, Shakespeare from the Waist Down does something very similar. Let me show you a few other experiments. This one is called Speaking While Female. We took the top 30 male speakers in Shakespeare's plays and profiled them against the top 30 female speakers in the plays. And immediately certain differences jumped out. I'll show you one of them. Take the top 30 speakers. Some of these women become men in the plays. but we assume that they're speaking as female until we do the next experiment, which is how do people change their diction when they're in drag. We count 500 different words. Now, it's not if, and, or but. It's about 500 words. That means that that three-dimensional space that I showed you is now a 500-dimensional space. We can't see it, but we can still measure it. And then we look for the words that differentiate characters by gender in statistically significant ways. Female speakers tend in Shakespeare to favor the following words: if, may, might, could, no, not, nor, never, but, yet, rather, and are, is, were. This is Viola talking to Orsino. She's now in disguise, and she's reasoning out how she would feel about him if she were a woman. This is actually a very interesting example because it shows a person who, let's say tactically, has to move at a disadvantage. She can't say flat out, I love you. And all courtships have those kinds of obstacles. I can't just say it all. So what ends up happening is she says things like, as it might be, perhaps, were I a woman. She never told her love, but let concealment, like a worm in the bud, feed on her damask cheek. Was not this love indeed? We men may say more, men, swear more, but indeed our shows are more than will. This is a speaker who, like many other women in the plays, has a language that is designed to react, to qualify, and to cope. Sometimes in fencing, that word cope meant being able to reach across and grab the enemy's weapon. But you can think of this language as being used as a kind of fencing, when someone has to work oppositionally against another speaker. It's about comparing what is to what might be. And perhaps that is the plight of female characters in Shakespeare's plays. I want to end with a final example, which really is speed reading. It's possible to take approximately 61,000 texts that were printed in England from roughly the 1470s to 1700 and fully search them. And in the experiment I'll show you now, we took all 61,000 texts and created from them one hugely long line of text. I suppose you could reach out all the way to Washington from here. There are 1.5 billion words in this collection called the Early English Books Online Text Creation Partnership Corpus. We've placed them in a sequence. This period covers roughly the first 2 centuries of print. We then train a neural network to start predicting context words that surround a target word. And let me explain what that means. So, to be or blank to be. What's that word in the middle? If I take a window of 12 words and go into this 1.5 billion word corpus millions of times, I go grab 12 words and I say, I see to be or to be. What goes in the middle there? What words are associated with those other words? The model can learn that the likely word in the middle there is not. That's after millions of trials and errors. This model then, you could think of it as a kind of a sphere, where words live together in a similar neighborhood if they are used together. And here the definition is you occur within 12 words of one another. If that happens, you get squished together in this space. What's interesting about this resulting sphere-like space, it's actually, in this case, a 200-dimensional sphere, is that if you live in one neighborhood over here, not only does it mean you're not the words over here, but I can move front and back in that space and pick up on cultural information. Maybe there's gender as a direction in this space. More female over here, more male over here, more noble if you're up here, more bass if you're down here. It's shocking that an algorithm can figure that out. So without telling the algorithm anything, I can ask that model, king is to man as woman is to, and it goes right across the space to queen. That's because relations of nobility are somehow encoded in that space. So I wanted to show you 3 pictures from working with this model. It's called a word-to-vec model of the EBO TCP corpus. And I can already tell that I'm going to need to point the words out because I have to put my glasses on to see them. Let me tell you what these are. I started with colors. I go to the region of that model that has colors. I said red and green. And then it goes around and says, tell me the 40 words that are in that area of red and green. And it finds words like vermilion, tawny, black, darkish, streak, blue, yellow, silver, red, violet. Sometimes it finds a word like flower, which makes sense because when you're talking about colors, sometimes you're also talking about flowers. So the first step is to go into that neighborhood and why don't you give me 40 words that live in that neighborhood? Now, this space is then structured around 2 axes. If you're further to the right here, you live in the direction of the words noble and beautiful. And if you're further up on the y-axis, you live in the direction of the 2 words base and ugly. I am using those word pairs as essentially directions in this high-dimensional space, and I'm asking, where do these words live in that space? This is an interesting result because we get some of the colors we would normally think of as maybe flower colors, violet, yellow, purplish on the noble, beautiful side. Green and carnation and purple, those make sense, purple being a royal color. But then we start to see the cultural associations with darkness playing out on the base side. So the colors that are above this line are those that live closer to this semantic neighborhood of baseness and ugliness. And here we see signs of the Renaissance cult and celebration of purity, and also its almost phobic dislike of darkness and blackness. And so here, tawny and black appear on the base and ugly axis, a darkish, brownish, yellowish, greenish. Within this space, I think what we're picking up is not only associations of beauty, but associations of what we call abjection. Now let's move to Shakespeare characters. I wanted to show you the color case first so that you could think about how it works. These are the names of Renaissance theatrical characters on the same axis. So we're still using those 2 directions of noble and beautiful that way, ugly and base that way. And here, on the noble and beautiful side, we have Ophelia, Desdemona, Rosalind, Romeo, Hamlet. Mercutio makes a lot of sense. Way up here, on the base side, is Othello. But interestingly, Othello also is far to the right. That is the definition of a tragic character, the kind of tragic character that Othello is as an outsider. He has these noble qualities, and he is seen as ugly and base. This is something that tells me that this is an interesting model. Caliban, less noble and beautiful, clearly ugly and base. Macbeth, Banquo, Macduff. Now, this is not just plays. These are associations taken from everything that was written in an edition for over 2 centuries. This is essentially a set of centenary judgments, moral judgments on these characters that comes through criticism, through adaptations of the plays, through literary commentary, but the model is trying to sum up all of that. Here's my last picture. This is a slightly more developed one. I've now taken base and vicious as a direction and pushed it over here. Noble and beautiful are further to the right. And then using gender, if you're affiliated with female, you're below, and male, you're above. This, too, is an interesting picture. One pair over here, Isabella and Amelia, seem in the judgment of this very long period of discourse to be the noble, beautiful female characters. And then up here, we've got Macbeth, Macduff, Othello, Polonius. That makes sense. He's noble, but he's not that noble. One of the things that I think is going to happen as we start to bring the resources of computing to these large collections of texts is that we're going to find out that culture is expressed almost everywhere, even at the level of individual words and association of words. And what I hope to see happening in the next 5 to 10 years is that we can build a bridge from the deep insights of literary historians and theater practitioners who have said, here's how I think these plays work, to the ways in which people end up talking about them for centuries. And this may lead us to a better sense of, let's say, Shakespeare as a writer was associated more with comedy or with tragedy. Female characters were often, females in general, were often assumed to do X more than Y, but here are some interesting outliers. The part that remains surprising to me is that an algorithm churning through millions of samples of 12-word sequences starts to compile a model that contains the kind of information about culture, whether it's gender, whether it's race or religious affiliation, that shows up mathematically in that space. That's the thing I don't think we were ready for when we started speed reading Shakespeare. But I think that's the thing we're learning. Thanks very much.
Now we have time for a Q&A, and as you raise your hand, we will bring a mic around for you.
So Shakespeare is like #1 writer in the world of all time, and for sure in English literature, right? Could you data explain this phenomena? Why he have this position unofficially, and why, for example, Hamlet could be considered the most famous play of all time?
Well, I would have two answers. One is what I've learned from reading the plays over time, which is that he tells stories that continue to resonate with people. He puts people in situations where there are big questions about why they love, lead, or follow one another, and those remain big questions. I think he was very good at finding those situations. He was also terrific with the spoken language. He knew how to take words from Anglo-Saxon, how to take words from Latin and from French, and put them together into a mix that really still defines English as we speak it today.
So could you calculate somehow in future why he is better
Right.
than somebody else?
I think in the future we will have a list that's a bit like the one I just gave you, but then at the bottom there'll be a set of linguistic descriptions. He also, and I'll tell you this because I know it, he tended to subordinate his sentences in interesting ways. He'll throw in a which then lets him editorialize about the action and then jump back out. He's also really good with imperatives. If you had one thing to pick a Shakespeare play out from, say, 1,000 other Renaissance plays, ask if a sentence starts with an imperative. I don't know if that makes him great, but I think it's connected to the way in which he built the action in his plays. So that what he let his actors do was to pause while someone physically did something on stage, and then they could resume the action with one of these, do, think, action words. But because he was such a dramatist, it affected the ways he chose his words. And so, in the case of Hamlet, we know from having done a network analysis that Hamlet talks to more other characters than almost any other hero in Shakespeare's plays. If you look at the network, it's like a wheel with an axis right in the middle. There's actually two big axes. One is Hamlet and one's Horatio. So literary critics have said that Hamlet is the first modern individual. He has depth. He seems to have something inside him that you can't fully express. I have that within which passeth show, he says. Well, maybe Shakespeare figured out how to do that by making Hamlet talk to as many other characters as he could, because every time Hamlet talks to someone, he changes the way he speaks. So as a character, Hamlet has one of the broadest vocabularies and the widest ranges of mood of any Shakespearean hero, and I think that was part of the trick. So that's an example of where counting things actually shines a light on some of that fancy footwork. I don't think it's the real reason why we love Shakespeare. I think it's because Hamlet is this dazzling, deep character who has problems like we have. And he tells a story in a way that we understand. But you have to do certain things to get that work done.
Next question is right over here.
I was wondering about the speed at which you can do this sort of analysis. If you sat down for a couple hours to do this, would you be able to do one or dozens, or how fast could you work through your imagination and get data on what you think might be interesting?
So it took my MacBook Pro 36 hours to create the model of 61,000 texts. It was just churning through, and I hoped that I didn't, lose power. And by the end of it, the model was done. So that's actually pretty fast, considering that I've just got a laptop, and once it's done, it's done. I can share it with other people. After that point, the limit is how many times can I come up with an interesting thing to ask about? So on some of those examples, I showed you characters. I can also do it with ingredients and recipes, because there's a lot of culture in what herbs people choose to put together, and some of those herbs come from a similar part of the world. So it's what questions can I start to ask? That's, I think, the limit. But the techniques for the comparisons, the model creation, and the queries are all available in open source software. And the last piece that needs to fall into place, in 3 years, all 61,000 of those texts will be in the public domain. So they're free to consult and consume in any way. Right now, we have about 25,000 of them. And all of Shakespeare's texts have been put online for free by the Folger in the most searchable, addressable form.
So how long would it take to do to work through one idea?
About 5 seconds. I did about 20 as I was. They told me to put my laptop away on the plane, and I just thought, I'll just, ask a few more questions. It can be done very rapidly, but the time is in understanding how the model works. I'm going to let her be the moderator.
Hi, I was curious, since you had Shakespeare's text and then subsequently what was written about them,
Yes.
if you queried to see whether a model that you generated from Hamlet
Yes.
would predict what the critics said about it, or maybe the critics got some parts of it and didn't
Yeah.
get other parts of it.
I think that's a great idea, and I think we will be doing that by comparing what Shakespeare says, let's say about Othello. Othello is one of the great outsiders. There's a whole bunch of words that are used about him. Let's profile that and find out what that neighborhood is. Now let's look at the rest of that corpus and ask if they're similar.
Because the wrap on this, the data reduction will come up with patterns. It won't fail to come up with patterns.
It always will.
Right.
And what I like about this last technique that I'm showing you is that it's easier to look at neighborhoods and judge similarity, but techniques like principal component analysis and other dimension reduction techniques produce many, many more patterns than there are names for, and they always do. a hand in the back over there.
In answering the first question,
Uh-huh.
does it indicate that Shakespeare was well educated?
You know, I don't think we would need to do these tests to show that he was well educated. From vocabulary tests, it's pretty clear that he read widely. He had the basics of a classical education. That's what leads us to think that he was a Latin grammar teacher. Ovid, clearly he read Ovid, but he also read Florio's translation of Montaigne. He read in history. I think it's kind of hearing those echoes that tells us that he was widely read. But in answer to your question, there are specific words that we think Shakespeare invented about 2000. If you now go and search for them in this large digitized corpus, we realize that he may not have even invented half of those. We're really, really wrong about how inventive he was. I think he was a really good stealer.
Next question's back here.
What advice or what insights could you give to theatrical directors?
Well, that's an interesting one. I would say the first thing is to start talking, because when we got that result of A Midsummer Night's Dream looking exactly like a history play, we just started scratching our heads and thought, well, what's that about? And then we went and talked to some actors at the Globe and a director, and they said, well, oh, of course. That's because you have to report all the fairy action, and you can't do the fairy action. You know, for them it was obvious, for us it wasn't. But a lot of these patterns are responding to the physical affordances and constraints of early modern theater as a presentational form. It's the architecture, it's the economics, and it's the dramaturgy. And the people who know that best tend to be performers, directors. So I would say that this kind of work is going to lead us deeper into a dialogue with our colleagues in the theater. And it may start to draw this away from the literary history where it's been for a century and a half. That's fine.
Did your research show that Shakespeare actually wrote all of his plays?
Well, we know from research that is like this that he collaborated on perhaps up to a third of his play, 30%. And many of those techniques actually involve counting words like if, and, but, for, to, the. So those techniques tell us that he collaborated often. But they also tell us that some of these pieces belong to him and others don't. So you may have read in the news that Christopher Marlowe has been credited as the author of the Henry VI plays by the New Oxford editors. People have suspected that for a while, but the computational evidence is just better. I think that kind of evidence is pretty good, and I think it shows us that Shakespeare worked with other people.
I'm curious, what do you think, or have you thought about, can you use this technique with tragedy and comedy with other authors?
The same techniques work with other authors, and one of the things that I find interesting is that an author's style is sometimes hard to separate from the types of stories that author chose to write. So in the case of Shakespeare, he has a very clear authorial style based on the choices of words he makes. That style looks an awful lot linguistically like the recipe for his history plays. Shakespeare wrote a lot of history plays, and he did it over and over and over again. So we can't get William Shakespeare to sit down and have a career where he writes almost all tragedies so that we could pull those things apart. But it's also the case that anytime you start looking at the linguistic texture of someone's writing, you're hearing a lot of different kinds of signal. One is author, but another is genre. And yet another could be the date at which it was composed, because certain words and forms were being used and others kind of disappeared. What interests me about all that is that they all kind of go together. We will probably never be able to fully pull apart these different things that make a writer who he or she is. But these same techniques are being used on novelists, on playwrights, and on poets. They're also being used on political philosophers and historians. Same techniques, just generalized to different writers.
Follow up on that, Michael. So what do you think is the best work or the most interesting work or the most surprising results happening in a domain other than the corpus that you primarily work with? I mean, in 19th century or 18th century?
I think the most interesting work that's happening right now is looking at when, I'll give you an example, the idea of rights, that the kinds of words that are used to describe rights shifts from being associated with feudal and monarchical structures to individuals. That's a key shift in the West of the kind of birth of something called possessive individualism. We've all talked about it as historians. Actually, now it's starting to look like that. That really is a march that we can spot. So looking at the major concepts that have been discussed in intellectual history, that's one of them. Another one is we suspect that the novel grew out of a confluence of travel writing, newspaper writing, and some observational science. Those three genres, right around the middle of the 17th century, just started to twist together and become something that eventually became the novel. I think eventually we'll get a map of that, which will tell us that really interesting cultural forms sometimes come about because of these crossings of streams. And you need a great writer to spot the opportunity, and like Shakespeare, and saying, oh, wait, a history play? Do that. We've done a couple. It's like Lin-Manuel Miranda saying, well, colonial history, yeah, let's do it with hip-hop. I mean, it's the same kind of idea that Shakespeare had about medieval history, putting it in iambic pentameter.
Next question here in the center.
I actually have a couple of questions for you. One is, if I understood your model with the characters, Macbeth and Macduff, they ended up in the same region, if I'm not mistaken, yet I tend to think of them interpretively as diametrically opposed to each other. Yep. So either I misunderstood your model or it was going for something else. So that's my first question. Yep. My second question is, have you discovered any commonalities with the problem plays or the later plays? Any searches that would reveal what constitutes those?
So on the first one, Shakespeare was actually reading history as he wrote Macbeth, and in the history of this period, Macduff is also someone who murdered. It gets in on the murder of Duncan. So whether this is the Macduff of Macbeth or from the sources that Shakespeare used, they're all together. But that bears more investigation. It's interesting that it's blurry. Yeah. The second question, if you think about the late plays, yes, there are several patterns that happen, but the most important one is the one that we've been calling comma which. At the end of most of Shakespeare's late plays, this is where a family that's been split up by chance and by accident, whether it's a boat or a war, they come back together and there's a series of multiple recognitions. To make a plot like that, a romance plot, work, you have to have someone describing his or her own history up to the point where they are right now, from past to present. And in between all of that, to make it emotionally powerful, you have to have them say how they feel now about what happened back then. That's actually the recipe. Shakespeare got it. He used it in his late plays. And to get that done in a sentence, you need comma which. I arrived in this city, comma which I had never seen before, but would eventually arrive at and find blank, blank, blank. Back to the sentence. So, he didn't have a soundtrack to color the meaning of a story, And he figured out a piece of syntax he could use, comma which. And then you just shift the tenses from past tense to present. Really reliable, really obvious in the late plays.
Thank you very much. If you think of any other questions, we encourage you to go down to 8:02 for our talkback immediately following this production.
Thank you.